Good evening, distinguished guests, colleagues, and friends. Welcome back to the Columbia Global Center for our first hybrid event. I would also like to welcome our virtual audience. Thank you for joining us. Just a couple of days before the March 2020 lockdown went into effect, we hosted what would be our last in-person event, a talk by columnist and author Roger Cohen on America's abdication of its historic role in the Middle East. As one takes stock of the past year and a half, it goes without saying how many of our conversations and norms have been altered, and how COVID has permeated so many aspects of our lives, personally as well as professionally. COVID has compelled us all to not only be prepared for the unexpected, but to be malleable and innovative. During this time at the Amman Center, we shifted our focus to virtual conversations, where we attempted to continue to engage our audiences with regional and Columbia-wide expertise and to feature the world-class knowledge and programming our friends had come to expect and enjoy from us. We look forward to the time when we can welcome back to the center all of our regular audience members. We are grateful and honored to have with us this evening Professor Timothy Brennan to discuss his book, Places of Mind, the first comprehensive biography of Edward Saeed, one of the most celebrated intellectuals of the 20th century. As Sarah Roy, senior research scholar at Harvard, wrote, Timothy Brennan's study of Edward Saeed is an outstanding intellectual and personal biography of one of the 20th century's most brilliant and debated scholars. Deeply researched and erudite, Places of Mind is also written with the elegance and power of a novel that Saeed himself would have admired. To read these pages is to understand the enormity of Saeed's often singular contributions and the profound void he has left behind. Edward Saeed was University Professor of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia University for over 4 decades and the author of more than 20 books. A leading literary critic, public intellectual, founder of the academic field of post-colonial studies, as well as a musical theorist, an accomplished pianist, and a passionate advocate for the Palestinian cause. He was born in Jerusalem in 1935 and died in New York in 2003. Professor Timothy Brennan, who studied under Saeed at Columbia and remained a friend until his death, had unprecedented access to his ideas and legacy. Drawing on extensive archival sources, drafts of novels and personal letters, and hundreds of interviews, Places of Mind examines Saeed's life and ideas. The book explores, as described in a Washington Post review, the full spectrum of sources that shaped Saeed's ideas, from the American critics Saeed admired to the French theorists he deconstructed and the Arab philosophers he wished were better represented in Western syllabuses. In this evening's talk, Timothy Brennan will explore some of the paradoxes of the biography's reception, focusing on 2 ideas: Edward Saeed as an Arab, not only American intellectual, and how his study of literary and cultural theory made his very public and political successes possible. Timothy Brennan currently teaches humanities at the University of Minnesota and is a member of both departments of Cultural Studies and Comparative Literature and English. He is the author of several books, including At Home in the World, Cosmopolitanism Now, Borrowed Light, Vico Hego and the Colonies, and Salman Rushdie and the Third World, Myths of the Nation. His essays on literature, cultural politics, intellectuals, and imperial culture have appeared in numerous publications, including The Nation, the Times Literary Supplement, and the London Review of Books. Please join me in welcoming Professor Timothy Brennan.
Thank you, Anya. I wanted to begin by giving general thanks for this invitation, which I'm quite honored to have, to both Hanya and Dana for inviting me here. And I'd like to extend also a great deal of thanks to Mohammed Shaheen. Professor Shaheen has been so instrumental in helping me at almost every stage of this project, introducing me to people and paving the way. And I especially am thankful to him for being the interlocutor in securing the Arabic translation of the biography, which is going to appear soon with Alam al-Marifa. By prior arrangement, my plan is to speak for about 30 minutes or so, and then we're going to open it up to questions and answers. So I'm going to throw some ideas out, and hopefully the real work will be done in the question and answer period. There are many things to consider in talking about a person of the immense global importance that Edward was, something that honestly it took me a long time to realize. He was a teacher, of course, and he was also a friend, but I guess it was in the publishing of this biography that I began to see just how profound his global influence remains, that he is somebody who still inspires people in every corner of the world. I wasn't sure when I began the project that people would be interested in Edward after all these years, having died in 2003, what is that, 18 years ago. And to my great satisfaction and surprise, he still is. So I wanted to tackle these two issues of the many that I could have talked about that Hania mentioned just now in her introduction. And I thought that the best way of capturing how those two ideas come together is to give the title Saeed in Exile. And I mean it in a slightly ironic way. Because in his most eloquent essay on exile, The Mind of Winter, which he published in 1984, I believe, in Harper's Magazine, he made a distinction between refugees and emigres, between the landless and politically hounded immigrants on the one hand, and on the other, expatriates who sought more hospitable surroundings for their artistic or professional careers. He wanted, I think in some ways, to disavow the term exile for himself, and certainly to disavow the term exile in the abstract, allowing, which, because it is a term that can allow more class-comfortable sorts who, by biographical accident or the misfortunes of history, find themselves living in foreign territory, to take on the unearned aura of the truly destitute, driven by war and famine, and collapsed economies and military terror, and more recently, climate extremes. This bringing to light in this essay, but not only in this essay, his own class privileges, I think is something that he always carefully adhered to and wanted to bring to the fore. Not only, as I say in this essay, but also in the articles that he wrote later in his life for various Arab publications. He even said so, really, to the point. He said, to call me a refugee is overstating it a bit. His family, for business reasons, had voluntarily left Jerusalem to do business in Cairo. But in Cairo, as those of you who know something about his career will say, that he witnessed, obviously, the people driven out of Palestine by Israeli terrorism in 1948. And of course, he saw up close the aid organizations run by his aunt. So it's something that he, for those reasons, kind of at one step removed, if I could put it that way, strongly identified with the plight of those forced out. Refugees cut adrift in Beirut, like those that he closely looks at in what is his most compelling work of fiction, a short story called An Ark for the Listener, which he attempted unsuccessfully to publish in the New Yorker. It was a common plight of his people that he projected himself into, rather than having experienced it personally. So he identified with Palestinian exile, and he certainly felt its pain acutely, as though it were his own. And he was moved by it often to exasperation and tears, and I think that kind of emotional response to this is very, very clear in the photo text collage book that he put together with Jean Moore, After the Last Sky. But it allowed him, I think, to reflect upon the often metaphorical ways in which the term exile can be understood. For example, professionally, as a critic of literature, he was deeply invested in the generation of old world emigres, many of them Jews, who had come to the United States to flee Nazi Germany after World War II, or before World War II. This too was a form of exile, it was a form of intellectual exile, which he felt also deeply and identified with. The sophistication of exiles brought to the United States inspired him to act, in fact, as their spokesperson and against the stream of academic fashions of his time. He publicized the world of these great polymaths, philosophers, and critics, Erich Auerbach, Leo Spitzer, Theodor Adorno, and others. These were the people who were transforming literary and cultural theory and giving him the leads that he himself would follow, again, against the stream of what was fashionable in the university at the time. He identified, if we can put it this way, with their identification of the United States as a provincial place in need of greater worldliness and an outpost of brutal common sense, as distinct from the old world European nuance and depth of these philological exiles. So one gets then a sense of the multifaceted way in which he understood exile. Let's not forget that one of the reasons he wished to disavow the status of exile, at least for himself, except, as I said, as a projection, is the familiarity of this idea in the official American mythologies about the origins of the United States itself. The nation likes to tell the story that it was created by persecuted religious exiles on an errand into the wilderness, a country that, despite millions of native inhabitants, was thought of as a land without people for a people without land. The parallels with later Israeli claims and justifications are altogether obvious, even painful. But this was the American ethos that he was responding against, and one of the reasons why he qualified his status as an exile. After all, I mean, the United States loves to think of itself as a capitalist paradise based on mobility, on fixity, uprootedness. This nomadism was, as his PhD advisor, Harry Levin, whom he really got a lot from. He really took a lot from Levin. Harry Levin, his PhD advisor, would point out that this image of the nomad was one of the staples of American fiction. The wandering Jew was its very emblem. So how could he, living in such a country, not feel the pain of exile? In this case, ideologically, even aesthetically, rather than literally or legally. So I think that professionally, of course, he was a teacher of modern British literature, and this would take us to another dimension of what exile might mean for Edward and what I mean when I title my talk, Saeed in Exile. Obviously, as everyone knows who knows anything about him, he was drawn throughout his life to the work of Joseph Conrad. And Conrad was, in some ways, unsurprisingly, a key figure. A lot has been written about this connection, and I need not go into it in too much depth because the biographical parallels are obvious. Both were creative men born on the periphery of Europe. They both traveled to the Imperial Center. They became assimilated there and mastered its language and cultural codes to such a degree that they became actually some of the metropolis's most representative figures. They were both mercurial men. They both loved Wagner, spoke French fluently, and both dwelt on the themes of empire, particularly the savagery of its conduct. Despite these points of contact, though, Conrad's attraction had also to do with his pessimism and his cynicism, which Edward did not share, which was in fact the very reason to abreact against Conrad. And this is the thing about Edward, is that he was frequently and perversely drawn to those who he disliked and disagreed with. And maybe to keep his readers a little off guard, would often use them as his inspirations, turning them on their heads. So apart from reviling Conrad's politics, is really something else that he gets from Conrad. It's not these obvious connections that I've just gone over here for a minute. It's about how to hide oneself, how to create multiple false personae in order to shield one from being fully known or understood. Conrad taught him how to invent a mask, to invent himself through writing. And as a young Palestinian intellectual who had identified with being Arab and Palestinian throughout his life, not only, as the story usually goes, after the Nakba of the Six-Day War of 1967, he arrived at Columbia in the early 1960s fearful of revealing everything that he thought and everything that he wanted. He needed somehow to protect himself from that. And so he created masks that I think often were coincidental with the belief he had about himself. That is, that there was a certain uncertainty throughout his life about who in fact he was. There was a psychological disruption, not merely an ethnic displacement. In Mahmoud Darwish's Counterpoint, which is an elegy directed to Edward Saeed, Darwish writes, I am from there, I am from here, but I'm neither there nor here. I have two names that meet in part. I have two languages. I forget with which I dream. Well, let's apply that to Edward. When Edward arrives in America, he is not American in his outlooks, tastes, and habits. He is, however, American by citizenship. In fact, he comes to the United States at the age of 15 in part to hold on to his citizenship. He arrives at the worst moments of the Cold War, which he hates. The brainless cheerleading of US intellectuals for the government's latest Imperial adventure abroad. It depressed and angered him. He'd already been schooled in a form of political alienation, a sense of internal exile, you might say, under the British regimes in Cairo, and also because of Britain's role in the establishment of the State of Israel and America's role in perpetuating it in the 1950s. This would make him not want to identify with being an American. And of course, he literally did dream in more than one language, breaking into Arabic in his sleep, speaking a fluid French with classmates, or shifting between Oxonian English and American Standard with hard-to-place cosmopolitan inflections. Throughout his life, he spoke a kind of transatlantic English, not obviously American. He would get angry with people who were Arabic speakers if they spoke to him in English. So his experience with exile in that sense can't really be thought of as his not living in Palestine. It's an open question about whether he would have lived in Palestine if given the chance. And when some of his compatriots, like Ibrahim Abul-Khod, decided at the end of the career after the Oslo Accords, when it became possible, to spend the final years of his career back in the occupied territories, Edward didn't follow him. And when Edward went to the occupied territories to make films or to interview people for his books or to gather material for the articles that he wrote for the Arab press, they were usually highly orchestrated, highly scripted affairs. It was his son, Walier, who went kind of as a grown man to Cairo to learn Arabic, who then went to the occupied territories to live for a year. And he was really the one who introduced Edward to, how do you put it, life on the street. So my point, though, is not to establish some sort of distance from the very real exile that he felt, or to somehow imply a form of inauthenticity. I think the fact of the matter is that Edward understood wholly and totally, was personally, emotionally, politically, and intellectually not quite right. That is, he was a man at war with any identity, understood intellectually or not. The whole question of identity, that is, of wanting to insist on one's difference from others, even when it was progressive to do so, that is, when it involved forms of affirmative action, were at some level for him, I think, a little redolent, a little, kind of implied a little too much about some of the sectarian conflicts and divisions of the Middle East. The fact is, he was a driven, agitated man in psychological turmoil and an antinomian. And because he cared so much about the intellectual life, I think he wanted not to forget the other forms of being in exile, that is, on the basis of your race or gender or ethnicity or sexual preference, but that he wanted to hold out for the equal importance of being ideologically in exile, politically on the outs. But the other point I think I want to say is that being outside Palestine is, in fact, a familiar Palestinian experience, and therefore not inauthentic at all. Many Palestinians experience that. And so when you find him writing a book like After the Last Sky, these poetic renditions that he has in response to these beautiful photographs taken in Palestine by Jean Moore, he very frequently misreads them. He very frequently gets the cultural codes wrong. Those who have lived in the territories were able to point out later that there's these mistakes. But I think that he wouldn't feel insulted were that pointed out to him. I think it's something that he built into the narrative, and it's part of what it is. It's exactly the point that he is projecting an imaginative relationship to the country that, for a variety of reasons, he can't be a part of. If we consider exile also from a more political angle, we can observe that Saeed was most at home around the militants of the Palestinian cause. I mean, he was always cordial, and anybody who ever met him could realize that he was an immense charmer. He knew how to read people perfectly, and he always made you feel like you were the most important person in the room. So he had those personal gifts. But there's a certain studied nature, I would say, to that, even though he pulled it off brilliantly without you being able to see that. Around the Palestinian militants, like Shafi al-Hout, for example, who's the author of this wonderful memoir, My Life in the PLO, he was genuinely at ease, giddy, you might even say. Just as his life models were radicals, whose profiles he never quite lived up to. Revolutionary martyrs that I think he admired because he himself could not measure up to their selflessness and sacrifice. The one-time Syrian Marxist friend of his, and they were very, very close at a certain point in his life, Sadiq al-Azm, after breaking with Saeed, said that he felt that Saeed never really played much of an important role in Palestinian negotiations, that his place was more or less cosmetic, that the Palestinian leadership loved to parade around these charming, dashing intellectuals like him and Darwish, but that he really didn't do very much to affect Palestinian options. So again, this is the whole question of political exile. It seems to me that al-Azm is quite wrong when you look more closely at Edward's actual record, that he not only was instrumental in helping to translate and modify Arafat's famous UN speech, but he also was instrumental in humanizing the image of Yasser Arafat at the most unwelcoming time in American politics, doing interviews with him or trying to portray him as a person who was funny and intelligent and sensitive and who listened. Of course, Edward was also involved in important negotiations with the State Department on behalf of the Palestinians, and he, I think, was very, very important in popularizing an older idea after the Oslo Accords of the one-state solution, which time will tell whether that was prescient or not, but it certainly did affect the discussion. And not to be forgotten is that he was a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, which is a place where many of the movers and shakers, the policymakers behind the scenes in the American imperial framework, meet and discuss. And he often was criticized for that, but I think it shows that in this way, or in these ways, and in many other ways, Edward was not merely a cosmetic presence. Let's think also about the fact that he lived in New York, that he was a quintessential New Yorker, that although he had many, many opportunities to leave New York for other illustrious places like Harvard, that he never really did. I wonder whether he ever really seriously considered doing it. Who is not in exile in New York, right? That would be maybe another way of putting it. A lifelong American citizen in a jumble of identities. What else is new? Not all of those identities, I stress, have to do with parentage or name or body or family ties. They have to do with outlooks, opinions, programs, platforms. There's also the advantages of being in exile. It isn't only that Edward, perhaps by temperament, wouldn't go back. It's more that it was better for him not to, that he was in a better political place being in the United States, understanding its cultural manias, closely following the media critiques of the functioning of American propaganda, finding a way to intervene in it, to find a place within it. These are things that he couldn't have done if he lived in the Middle East, which he did, in fact, actively consider doing at one point in his career in the 1970s, and his wife, Mariam, talked him out of it. So I think privilege, which I began with, is less important than what one does with it. And this is another thing. The question of Edward's Arabness cannot avoid the question of his relationship to the Arabic language. I've already said something about that, but let me say something else. That people who are critical of him, people who liked to project the notion that he was inauthentic, would often say that he never really mastered classical Arabic, that he couldn't get up and convincingly give a speech in Arabic. He did do so, but people say it never quite worked, it got the better of him. And yet, for the Arab newspapers that he wrote for, he originally began writing them directly in Arabic for those Arab publications that are Arabic. And according to his research helpers and Mariam, he did fine. He could do it perfectly. Obviously, he was fluent in Cairene and Palestinian spoken Arabic, but this relationship to the literary language, if I could put it that way, which matters so much for an intellectual of his stature, is, I think we'd have to say, an open question. The other thing I'd say is that one thing I certainly knew a little about, but didn't really know the extent of, is how systematically Edward, as an Arab intellectual, apprenticed in the work of the Nahda intellectuals, that he closely read and followed the interventions of Clovis Maqsood, for example, writing not only about the caricatures of Arabs in the Western media, but also testifying before Congress in 1941, a kind of thing that Edward would later do. Abdallah Laroui, very important, the crisis of the Arab intellectual, very important work for him. Albert Harani, to kind of dig up the origins of Arab humanism. And most of all, of course, Constantine Zurek, a friend of the family, somebody actually related to his family by birth, that he not only read closely, as almost everyone did, but who he frequently talked to and took his leads from and was counseled by and pushed back against. Of course, there's also the very unusual example of the right-wing, anti-Muslim statesman from Lebanon, Charles Malik, who was the wife of his mother's cousin, Eva, and who he grew up with in Dur al-Shwer and in Cairo, and who he stayed at the house of as a young man. Malik was his guardian when Edward was over studying alone. So here you've got somebody who was a philosopher and who was an intellectual, who had studied with the likes of Heidegger and had studied with the likes of Alfred North Whitehead, who was also a diplomat and a major figure in the United Nations, helping to write the Universal Declaration of Human Rights with a team of others. I think it's rather interesting when we have this question before us of Edward's Arabness, that there are these figures that, I don't mean they were just kind of distant influences that because they were Arab were a model to look up to or follow. I'm saying that he systematically read through their work and took his leads from their work, turning it around. I'd like to say one other thing about, because I've been talking about his Arabness as he perceived it. I've been problematizing the fact that when we think about Edward in Exile, that we would only think about how the degrees to which he was Arab versus American. His daughter Najla loved to say that although in performance, Edward came across as kind of Europeanized, right? He was well put out, expensively dressed, and again, there's that transatlantic English that I was talking about. And his love for European intellectuals and theory. But that he was, in fact, extremely American. That he, of course, loved to read schlock novels, right? Popular novels. He loved to see action flicks. He was weaned on American Hollywood films even before he moved here. He had a favorite show that he would watch on Saturday afternoons, of all things, called Dance Fever, right? A kind of sexualized dance contest show. He would get up one day and say, I want to eat Franks and beans. We never eat Franks and beans. And he'd run out and get baked beans in a can and hot dogs and come home and make them for the family. So these are quirks that also are repetitions of a way, since his father had left the Middle East to go to the United States in order to escape the Ottoman draft early in the 20th century, and had picked up a lot of the habits and tastes of Americana, and would, in fact, pass these along to his kids. So despite Edward's rejection in some ways of this connection with his father, didn't follow him in the family business, certainly, he repeated many of these Americanized gestures. But there's also then not just what a person feels themselves to be or how they act linguistically or culturally. There's also the question of intellectual affiliations. And the last great point that I would make here about those Arab intellectuals from whom he learned so much would be the way that he, and he was far from alone in this, oriented himself to the great medieval historiographer Ibn Khaldun. I think this is the origin, for example, in Khaldun's work of the affiliation distinction in Edward's own writing. It's really in Khaldun that we get the first labor theory of value, which has something to do with Edward's orientation to Marxist thinkers. The idea, and this is very important in Khaldun, right, that the importance of writing a history accurately, right, because Edward is reading this and learning from this at a time that many of the people in the profession of letters, in the humanities, were arguing that there's no such thing as an accurate history, that there's no such thing as writing a non-mythological history. It's invented. And anyway, any text that one creates is really recreated by the reader with the infinite latitude, the infinite freedom to read it any way you want. These are the ideas that were coursing through his world when he instead is taking his lead from Khaldun, whose whole purpose in writing the Muqaddimah was to show how history writing before had been inaccurate and to teach us how to write accurately. It's Khaldun who tells us that the way to distinguish one historical period from another or one culture from another is by means of their social organization. It's a profound idea that he deploys, he puts into action in his own work. But it's also this image, which I think I've already brought up once before, of the intellectual as a man of action, right? That Khaldun wasn't merely a brilliant scholar and researcher and historian, but he was a diplomat and a counselor to kings. Finally, it is this wonderful distinction in Khaldun's Muqaddimah between the culture, between the country and the city, between cultures that are considered backward for being rural and cultures that are considered cosmopolitan for being urban. This whole question of the economic division of labor that involves writing. Literature is part of the economic division of labor in Khaldun, right? It's this notion of writing being one craft, among others. I think now I just would like to turn very briefly to that second point that we were making, or that I promised that I would have something to say, and that is about Edward's work, his study of literature and culture, and how that study of literature and culture made his political and public successes possible. And I really want to dwell on this point because one of the reasons that I wrote the biography in the way I did, that is as an intellectual biography, of course there's all kinds of anecdotes and personal stuff, including embarrassing stuff, which is inevitable in telling the story of anybody's life. There's still the decision to make the narrative arc of the biography be primarily the making of an intellectual, how he became the intellectual he was, and to show the connections between those different periods of his life. And I want to stress it because it's so often denied. I think so many people who care about, Edward's so many different people, right? As a man in the world and as an intellectual, some people really are only oriented to one of those people and not the others. And I wanted to bring them all together and to show how they were connected. So it's very often easy for people to say, well, I really love what he did and he was fun to listen to and I understood him when he was talking politics, but not really when he was talking about literary theory. So here I would just, in my closing comments here, talk about why I think that wouldn't be a very good attitude to have if you want to understand Edward Said. First of all, when you have the privilege of plowing through the archive and you look at his undergraduate and graduate essays, and a lot of what is there is, in fact, not even essays, they're just notes that he was taking from his reading and from the classes that he was taking. You see a consistent motif. I don't mean it's just here and there. It's everywhere. A consistent motif of his exploration of the connection between literature and politics. He talks about it again and again. He's very self-conscious about it. He also was much more philosophically oriented as an undergrad, and he was reading the classics, of course, given the schools that he went to, Princeton and then Harvard, he would have done so, especially in those years, right, the 1950s. But he's really drawn to long discourses on people like Plato and Dante and Milton because of their unashamed didacticism. Because these were great writers that people recognize as great writers who nevertheless were hortatory in their approach. They had a point to make. They wanted to persuade you about something, usually something very, very important, of world importance. So these seeds of what we later understand Edward to be are sown very, very early in these kinds of examples. Of course, he was drawn to figures like Khaldun, I said just a minute ago, but also to people like Jonathan Swift, because Swift, once again, was a person who not only wrote novels and poems, but was a counselor at court and a diplomat, somebody whose writing, at least early in his career, was part of the struggle. And so it's in that mentality, that is, the writing that he did was interventionist. It was something that was seen as entering the world and attempting to change it. And that it was during that period of time in his career, Swift's career, that Swift theorized the idea that true eloquence is about plain speaking and how to, in fact, adopt as a writer a more conversational tone. And so writer after writer after writer that he is drawn to, Gerard Manley Hopkins would be another example, make this point in their own way, that it, insofar as writing can imitate the flow and accessibility of the spoken language, the better. So this is something he learns as a literary theorist, but it is something that I'm implying is, in fact, put into action in his essays. So, literary figures of a different type, which he emulated. The other side of it is, I think, is this, that if you're going to enter the public sphere and be heard, it pays, in some ways, to be unthreatening. What could be more unthreatening than a professor of literature? You're widely read, you're curious about what you don't know, you're drawn to knowledge for its own sake. Your particular authority is granted to you because you have no power, because you have no financial stakes, because you are a general, non-partisan observer. And I do think that this afflatus, if I could put it that way, of the literary man, right, which might seem a little old-fashioned, but that is part of Edward's success, is that he was deliberately old-fashioned. He dressed in an old-fashioned way. He hung on to old-fashioned ideas. He loved writers from the past who were involved in certain kinds of endeavors, intellectually, like philology, that were long dead and certainly unfashionable. And then there was, of course, one of his secret weapons in any interview is ingenuousness, right? And sincerity. This was the postmodern age, right? The only way to actually be heard was to undercut the possibility of meaning or to mock any belief in the grand narratives of history, right? This was happening on the purported left as, even as much as on the right. And I think that this ability to cut through the evident cynicism of the television interview with a statement about truth and justice, and to ingenuously mean it, was a very, very important part of this model of the literary intellectual that he put forward. He felt that it was really the humanist intellectual more than any that could do this performance the best. Finally, or maybe not finally, but one other point is that the other thing about the study of literary criticism and its relationship to its political effectiveness has to do with the fact that what he was studying was the art of representation, right? And a lot of mischief takes place in any verbal encounter. It isn't just people who are lying or who are deceiving or who are writing, caricatures, false portraits of others. Representation itself is filled with misunderstood meaning, with added meaning. A lot gets lost in the transfer from concept to articulation, and then again from articulation to hearing. So it's somebody like him, given the debates of the time, but also just a student of language and literature per se, who would be particularly alert to this aspect of language. And so it really turns out that when you look at a book like Orientalism, it isn't just about mischaracterizations or misrepresentations, it's about representation. And it's saying that representation itself is not a reflection of the world, it's in the world, it's part of the world, it creates things. And to believe that, as he did, with this particular kind of authority that I was saying that he gained from his own image of the intellectual, allowed him to see what needed to be done and how. So it made him certainly rhetorically deft, and one of the ways in which he achieved this rhetorical deftness was to summon forth what I would call vague coinages that acquire symbolic weight. Right? So here you are, you're writing for multiple audiences. You're trying to communicate to PhDs and students of theory, in the seminar room, at the same time that you're trying to reach Palestinian activists on the ground, and a lot of people in between. The great dead middlebrow center of the media world, right? And so how do you do that in a way that you don't lose people, or on the one hand, or water down on the other? And I think one of the ways he did it is to come up with these coinages, like filiation and affiliation, or like the dynastic, or like Orientalism itself. These became talismans of a sort, right? It became impossible to think about this oeuvre of his without. It became impossible not to think about this oeuvre of his and all its byways and all of its details when you hear these words that he put into circulation. Not defining them, in fact, completely. This is part of the art of the vague coinage, is that the contrapuntal, to take another one, right, is one that works because it can mean a lot of different things. Because it is, of course, first literally about counterpoint. He studied counterpoint and wrote about counterpoint in its musical form alone. But it then also was a kind of a slogan that he meant to disrupt a slogan that was then widely in circulation within post-colonial studies, which he disagreed with, which was the notion of hybridity. So hybridity means a kind of a fusion of two once alien or antagonistic cultural or political forces, until you have one entity that's sort of mutually implicated, if I could put it that way. Whereas counterpoint is about two independent lines of force that meet at times and are in harmony, but that at the other times go their own way. It's a very different image with a very different politics. And so I think that this is an idea that he never really pinned down and was clever not to have done so. He's also, of course, was skillful throughout his life at evasion. And this, too, is a rhetorical technique. And I would say it's a very conscious technique, that he fashioned a syntax that sidesteps unwanted encounters, that avoids direct confrontations while still making its point. This is not to say that he was not capable of a polemical encounter that would tear the heart out of his opponents. He could be quite virulent, particularly in his music criticism, I would say, where he really lets it all hang out, right? Perhaps because he's got nothing to lose. But there are moments and there are moments, and he is attempting this move to the left, if I could put it that way, this move to something more worldly during the worst excesses of the Reagan-Thatcher counter-reformation. So I think, although during the years that this was going on, I was often sort of disappointed that Edward didn't take on some of the enemies that I wish he had, I can understand in retrospect why he didn't do so, and I think that it has to do with some of this rhetorical training that he went through as a literary critic. He leaves us with ideas that are both political and literary at the same time. The right for everyone to tell their own story. The university is a utopian space that should not be there to teach people useful lines of work, but to be there to say no to what exists, to think differently, to summon the intellectual as the guardian of the historical record, the setter of agendas, and the thinker of what is possible but does not yet exist. I mean, this is what the university should be training. And his distrust of all governing systems. So I don't know how long I've been talking. I'd be happy to talk some more, but I think I probably said enough for now, and I really look forward to our question and answer period. So thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that very compelling talk, and we appreciate the interesting ideas that you've weaved through this evening. We'll now be moving to our question and answer portion of the evening. Thank you for everyone being with us in person and online. And we have our first question.
Good afternoon, good evening, actually. My name is Nasib Murad. I have bought the book through Amazon or somebody who sells it, and I've had the privilege of reading the first 100 pages. Being as young as I am, it takes me a long time to read these things. And I find your book very interesting, and it made me feel like as if we're living with the person, and that you have such an insight about him as a person and as a family. And I wanted to ask you if you think there was something rebellious in him, that he thought that living in Cairo and working with the father's business, which was apparently thriving, was not his game. And I think his mother referred to that thing saying, this business pays the bills and is paying for you in America. But I had the feeling that he was, it wasn't his scene. And I don't know, what would you comment about that?
Is this working? Yeah. Thank you for that wonderful question, and thank you for your comments. What? Hold it down? Okay. Sorry. It definitely wasn't his scene. I mean, he spends a year in Cairo between graduating from college and going to graduate school. So he gets a big fellowship to Harvard. He delays it for a year, and he goes back to work in his father's business, partly to figure out whether this is for him, partly to help his then ailing father, and partly to comply with the wish of his Aunt Melia, who's really not his aunt, it's actually his great aunt, but they called her Aunt Melia, who wanted him to go into business. And when you read, to me, as this person who wrote a biography, one of the kinds of material that I found the most rewarding and that I learned the most from actually have to do with his student transcripts, what teachers are saying about him and what he himself is expressing about himself in these application letters. And it's very clear that he, on several occasions, is absolutely determined to move back to the Middle East. He's studying pre-med through most of his schooling. And he wants to go back as a medical missionary, is what he says, okay? Or to follow a line of business. This is what he says. So he's not at all rebellious in some ways. At least maybe he doesn't want himself to come off as rebellious to the people at the school to which he's applying, but he sounds sincere, that he wants to go there. Maybe some line of education, maybe business, maybe a medical missionary. And the idea of being a missionary is kind of interesting because it's another thing I think I discovered when doing this, is that although he would tell everybody who listened that he was an atheist later in life, although he was a little bit more cagey in certain situations about saying that, he nevertheless was somebody marked by his Anglicanism culturally throughout. And it really did help form him in all kinds of ways, particularly musically and in relationship to the English language. So this idea of the people that were the political radicals in his life, right? Farid Haddad, the Marxist Egyptian intellectual who was killed in the prisons. He considered them to be like martyrs. He considered them to be like missionaries. And so he's got this strong ethical drive to go back and do work for his people, right? So it takes many forms. But so he goes back, and I think that he'd already, by that point, had studied too long in literature and had his own literary ambitions. And some of the most revealing writing of Edward about this not being his thing, this working in his father's business, can be found in his attempt at a novel, which he was writing during that time. He was doing opera reviews in Cairo. I think it was the Egyptian Gazette that he wrote for. He's writing poetry for small magazines over there. So I think by the time he gets over there, number one, he's not good at it like his father, and he has to be good at things. Number two, it's a sinecure, and his father is respected and he's not, and he feels that acutely. And thirdly, he's got these other ambitions. So he's already accepted at Harvard. He's already kind of on his road to being an intellectual. It's in Cairo that he's reading a lot of these dense thinkers that become so important for him later, like Vico and Nietzsche and others, right? So it's a crux of a time. So I would really love it if it were available. Maybe I can help make it available for you to read the drafts of this novel, because it really would, in technicolor, as it were, answer your question about exactly the mental process he went through to say no.
I happened to have dinner with him in a very small circle of 7 or 8 people at the time when he knew he had cancer.
Yeah.
And it looked to me like a troubled man who had so much to give, and yet he knows that the end is so near. And this is the impression I got from that one dinner of him.
Right.
He was a bit troubled, and it's difficult, of course, to deal with such a case, especially that he knew it was becoming really difficult, and he had a yellowish face, color from medication or something.
Yeah, this is, obviously we're entering slightly different territory here, but just on that note, I think that, no, he was psychologically devastated by this news. And because, the original prognoses were not good at all. They were saying you're going to be dead in 2 years or 3 years or something like that. So I just happened to have invited him to come speak at my university, which was on Long Island, in New York, right after he had been diagnosed. And a colleague of mine had just been diagnosed with a terminal cancer at the same time, a younger guy. And I can't ever forget what Edward was like at that moment. He was like a little boy, actually, avidly comparing notes with somebody else who had just received a similar death sentence. And he was not obviously morose. He wasn't depressed. He was frenetic, if anything. But clearly this was a mask for something that he was just attempting to grapple with. Happily, he met Kanti Rai, this a doctor who, through a combination of treatments, made him beat the odds and allowed him to live. But we could, for much longer than those 3 or 4 years of the earlier prediction. But you know, we can't forget that he died, by today's standards, very young. I mean, he died 2 months shy of his 68th birthday. It's really too bad.
We have a question from our online audience.
Yes?
At the beginning of this talk, Saeed was described as the father of post-colonial studies, or something to that effect. Would Saeed would have wanted to be described as such?
No, I don't think so. I think that he understood that post-colonial studies was a field that grew out of what he had launched in the book Orientalism, and that in most respects, post-colonial studies was completely salutary, right? That it was interested in making up for the complete and shameful silence towards the original work that was being done in other parts of the world, particularly the former colonies. It was shameful how little the composition of faculties at American and British universities included people of color or people from other countries. And so inasmuch as post-colonial studies was the form taken by this movement from below to meet those ends, it was something that he would never speak out against. In private, I would say he was much more derogatory. He would even say that in his seminars, he outlawed the use of the word colonize, unless it actually had to do literally with colonization in its normal sense. In other words, this metaphorical use of colonize for, I don't know, somebody colonizing an argument, for example, he said, no, 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 no. So here's what I think maybe might be going to the heart of the question, if I understand it. Edward came of age at the tail end of the golden age of the anti-colonial liberation movements. His take on theory, his skepticism towards literary theory, even though he helped launch it in some ways earlier in his career, was deeply affected by the reading of Amilcar Cabral, right, of Guinea-Bissau, one of the leaders of the anti-colonial liberation movement. So Edward was involved in the Palestinian struggle, which, after all, is, in the end, not about border crossing or hybridity or the transnational or globalization. It's about the establishment of a political state on a non-negotiable strip of land and the protection of borders. It's a civic understanding of liberation that was quite in concert with the anti-colonial liberation movements themselves. A lot of his efforts in Orientalism and after were to try to get the people involved in the anti-war movement to understand that marching on behalf of Vietnam, terrific, why not do so on behalf of Palestine? It's a similar struggle. Ibrahim Abu Luhod is the one who really sort of trained him as a very young man, right, in the facts of life, as it were, of the revolutionary movements going on in Asia and Africa. And this allowed him to see the Palestinian struggle in those terms. This was his cross to bear, to get this across to people in the United States who didn't think this way. We're completely at the mercy of the Israeli narrative. So, inasmuch as this is what he's for, what is post-colonial studies for? They're not for a politics of the state. Their idea is not to create a new government or establish sovereignty or develop a country that is underdeveloped by the underdevelopment of imperialism. They're against modernity, right? They're against the narratives of humanism, right? Now, they're doing this for what are perceived by them to be progressive causes, and it's a very, very complex arena, obviously, and I'm foreshortening it so much, but I'm just trying to get at some of the basic differences between his outlook and theirs. So I think he was he wanted to put distance between himself and post-colonial studies in this respect, although not openly, right? Because because post-colonial studies was under attack. And what it was doing, although limited and perhaps not theoretically the correct perspective from his point of view, was good as far as it went.
Hello, thank you for this very engaging talk. I really appreciated when you brought up the part where you talked about the importance of literature and culture in Edward Said's work and its relationship to his politics, and obviously talking about how Edward was had many personalities and many he was many people in one, but oftentimes we just focus on one aspect of his work. So I was wondering if you can speak a little bit more about his final work, which you dedicated a good part to in your book on late style, and obviously you also talked about Saeed the musician, but also, I guess, as we just said, realizing that he had very little time left, and being devastated by his the very short time available to do all the things he would have wanted to do, to dedicate that time to this very different type of work on late style. I would love to hear more of your thoughts on that and its significance.
Okay, thank you. Well, a couple of things. I mean, he gets the idea, obviously, from what appeared in essay form. It was actually part of a longer work on Beethoven, written by Theodor Adorno. And he takes it up. And I think some people have pointed out, they've recognized right away, that what Edward means by late style is very different from Adorno, but they think that this is Edward not getting Adorno correctly, whereas I don't agree with that. I think that it's a quite different place that you want to take this concept to. So if you read the book, and you read it closely, and I think it's important to say parenthetically that it is not a book that Edward wrote, in the sense that it was a compilation of talks that he had given at the Collège de France at the request of Pierre Bourdieu, that are then supplemented by other essays that were never intended by Edward to eventually go into this book called On Late Style. So it's a posthumous book, and it is of the creation of more than one person, right? So it's Michael Wood, who I think did a fantastic job putting the book together from existing talks and essays of Edward, and Mariam, I think, his widow, in concert put this book together. So anything we say about it, I think, has to be maybe qualified in to that degree. But so Edward, is the on late style that Adorno is talking about has to do with a kind of the freedom of the artist in full command of their powers to go back to simpler forms in order to show how the essence of their art is composed of them, something along those lines, right? It doesn't necessarily mean what work was created late in one's life. It has to do with lateness as a concept that can be used somewhat metaphorically. Edward is talking about both writers and musicians who, for various reasons, at the end of their life, lose their original elan. They no longer stand for principles. They become ironically detached from their earlier powers. And they become formalistic or nostalgic or recidivist, right? They kind of go back to earlier forms, like from earlier centuries, in order to create confections, because they no longer have anything to say, and yet they have all of these formal talents that allow them to pull off a work. So I think that, so Richard Strauss would be an example of one of the people that he talks about in this respect. And of course, Lampedusa would be another, right? One of the most depressing, apolitical, anti-political novels that you could possibly read is The Leopard by Lampedusa. And Edward, personally to me, many times came up and said, have you read this? Have you read it? You haven't read it? Oh God, you've got something waiting for you. He loved this book. But when you read On Late Style, you wonder why. Because Lampedusa represents what he's fighting against in this book, as I read the book, which is, look, let me just be plain about it. I think this is Edwards talking to himself, saying, I'm getting to a point where I'm fed up with politics, and I don't want to get there. I want to keep fighting, and so I want to find a way, as death approaches, to keep some of the original spirit of my younger work alive.
Hi, this is Arshid. So this question is actually posed from Najla Saeed, when there were escalation happening earlier this year, between Gaza and Israel. There were memes on the internet where, when, the context is a lot of, people in the academia in the US were silent about what was happening, and they were, afraid to take stances against Israel, because of the repercussions that awaited them. And the meme was that, every other US academic, and then there was a picture of Saeed, throwing stone in Palestine. This was his visit that created controversy back in the 2000s. Najda was actually way upset with it, and I quote her, she said that my dad would be very angry if he were to see this meme. And I quote her, "It caused a major depression for him at the end of his life," and she was worried that this was what all was written about in the final days of his life. Why, for a figure that we see as an icon of resistance and liberation, why do you think, he took, so much care in letting go of that, picture? And it doesn't break the law, but what do you think, it caused something, in her words, as close to a depression? Since you know him and you have, you count him as a personal friend, I thought if you could throw some light on it, would be nice. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, the politics of representation. There's a really telling scene in one of these Indiana Jones movies. I don't know if you've seen them or if you know what I'm talking about, but these Orientalist Hollywood films with Harrison Ford. And there's a duel that's taking place in the public square, and this highly Orientalized portrait of a Middle East dark person comes out with a big scimitar, and he's dressed in regalia, and he's wielding the scimitar, and there's all this kind of ritualistic stuff he does to show that they're about to enter combat. And Indiana Jones looks at him quizzically and just pulls out his gun and shoots him in the head and walks away. And the reason I'm telling that story is it seems to me that, here is this decades-long career that was established in 3 or 4 completely different areas, that was at the very height of each of these professions that he entered. He's world-renowned. He's done everything he can and more to change the narrative. And this act of throwing a stone is then trumped up in the pages and put on the second page of the New York Daily News, and he's accosted by people that don't measure up to his knee, like Paula Zahn, I think, was one of the journalists who was giving him a hard time, more than a hard time, actually ridiculing him, insulting him on TV. And they have that power to create something that doesn't exist in a single image, to undo everything else. And so I think he realized that he had all of the means at his disposal to articulate why this is ridiculous, and did. But the power of the media in this case and its distribution was going to render nugatory what his explanation was, however good it was. And so partly his depression comes from that recognition. People don't really, I think, give enough attention to how deeply invested Edward was in reading media theory and theories of the information industries and the knowledge factories, right? Fritz Matschlup was a person who wrote about how knowledge circulates institutionally. And this was one of the people he loved to quote, but Armand Madalar or actually Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky and their theory of US propaganda. There's many other people like this, but he's very, very attentive to how information flows and how one can be a part of those circuits, but also be, sort of at the receiving end. And so I think that he's depressed in part because the media has this power in this particular case to make him look bad. He's also depressed because he didn't see it coming. And because he was the one who, the photograph was taken by Al Jazeera, and the people who took the photograph asked him in the hotel room the night after it was taken, or the night of the day in which this happened, is it okay, we're gonna circulate this, we're gonna put this on the news show? And he said, sure, fine, not knowing what people would do with it. How does a narrative turn? How does a perception get created? It's a very, very elusive sort of question. And I think he recognized, much to his chagrin, that he was going to be on the losing battle here, that it was going to give people a justification who, of course, were doing this for underhanded and disingenuous reasons to make him look bad with a single gesture, with a single anecdote. That's all it took. I don't know if that gets at what you're talking about, but that's what I think is going on. And it's by the way, Najla is completely right. Many people I talked to confirmed that he was deeply depressed when this story broke.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting. One time I read a statement on a memoir saying that writing your memoir sometimes is not easy, especially with the tyranny of memory. So I'm really interested to know if you've been through this tyranny of selection when you try to capture the stories and the narrative about Edward. This is the first one. The second one is in Out of Place. I felt that there is a lot to be tackled regarding the politics of departure and politics of return. And the fact that he could not finish his novels is in a way a manifestation of the fact that he's in a continuum of creating archaeology of departure, return, memory, and being able just to move on with the flow. Sometimes flow of resistance or flow of enunciation and articulation of his own story. Thank you.
Wow, those are two really insightful questions. Let me take the last one first because, there's a lot of people who are involved as literary critics in the profession of letters who attempt to write a novel. But I made as much as I did of Edward's attempts, there were two of them, because I think they were so good. They really showed me. Somebody said that about his piano playing, that he played piano like he played tennis as a competitive sport. He liked to be good at things. And I think that he was surprisingly good as a writer of prose fiction. Whether he could have pulled it off or not, I don't know. I think so. I think he could, but I don't think that he didn't pull it off because he couldn't. Now, I have no way of proving that, but when you look, for example, in his second attempt, which is happening in the late 80s and the early 90s, before he begins writing his memoir Out of Place in earnest, and in some ways I think that memoir takes the place of the second novel that he was at work on. When you look at that and you compare it to the things that he was saying in interviews at the time, and really kind of a motif that kind of goes through his career, Edward was very upset that intellectuals were not given a stage in the United States. The United States is a profoundly anti-intellectual culture. It's either scientistic and technophilic, or it's low-grade, commonsensical balderdash that makes fun of people who are educated. And that's the kind of place that the United States is that he was entering. And so he's saying, why is it that the people who are within the humanities given the microphone and allowed to express their opinion and pronounce on the state of the world, they're novelists and they're poets in the United States, right? Not intellectuals. And I think that he felt that the critic, right, the naysayer, the one who, without the cover of fiction, if I could put it that way, right, directly confronts a power. And as I said before, like not only guarantees the historical record that it be preserved, but also is thinking about possible futures, you know, who creates a new agenda. That figure of the intellectual is what he felt himself to be. We fought hard for others to become, and that he wanted a place for in the United States. So I think that he said, nope, I don't want to be one of those people who also wrote a novel. I take my stand with being a critic. That's what I am. And I want to be remembered that way. Then your first question, which was equally good, was about the selection process. Edward's memoir is one that I resisted reading for a long time because I told myself, way before I ever thought of writing a biography, I thought to myself, I don't care about his personal life. All I care about is what he stands for and what his ideas. And then when, of course, one can't write a biography without reading the memoir, I read the memoir and I just was blown away for a couple of reasons. One, because of his narrative sense, because of the moments of true Proustian depth that he manages to accomplish there. Partly that's what impressed me. But what impressed me, it's just so readable and so honest and so, but it's something that is filled with absences and gaps that are not the gaps of memory. They are intentionally left out for a variety of reasons. And so in my biography, I don't know if I accomplished, but I tried to fill in the gaps of what he didn't talk about. And to correct the record in part, because I think the portrait of his father, which his family, his sisters, were so enraged by, was not accurate. The people who knew his father, and I saw myself correspondence between them that belied the relationship as he understood it and talked about it. So I try to correct and also fill in that part of the life that the memoir addresses. But of course, the memoir ends with him at college, so the most important part of his life isn't ever memorialized by him. But when it comes to memory, let me just say this, that the people that I interviewed who are from his early life, right, they cannot believe that he remembered so accurately what he remembered. I mean, what is there, right down to the intonations of voice and the gestures of hands and the particular event that took place here and there, it's a prodigious, detailed recounting. So the archive's filled with letters of people from this earlier life that say, thank you for bringing that alive. I didn't even remember those things, but the minute that you said it, I recognized it in all of its detail. So when it came to my writing about him, what do you include and what do you leave out? I think that I've partly addressed that by saying that I wrote an intellectual biography, which was going to be nevertheless the story of a life, which involved many things that were personal. But I certainly didn't want it to be something that got into every aspect of his personal life, something that sort of, to me in an unseemly way, many biographies like to do this. The one on Philip Roth that just came out tries to do this. It gets into all the scandals, right? Super highly sexualized for one thing, but then it also gets into the dirt and grime of everyday life and long conversations and embarrassing moments, and it's just it's sensationalist. It's just this kind of thing to kind of, here's a famous person, let's rake that over the coals to create interest and sell books. And that's something that I wasn't really interested in. But there's another kind of decision constantly that I had to make, and that is when you interview hundreds and hundreds of people, many of whom want to talk about themselves, by the way, and not Edward at all, right? You really have to triangulate because people misremember, or they don't tell the truth, or they remember conveniently. And so it's really kind of difficult about what to include or what not. But I will say this, that what I did try to do is, I had my take on Edward. I knew him as a person in the world, and so I could have written this thing very differently if it was all about my views of Edward. But what I tried to do is let the people that I interviewed and the actual materials that I got from the archive speak for me. I wanted somebody to page back to the footnotes and see the progression of statements made and where they were coming from, so that this was a collective story, that it wasn't just my story. I was trusting people. Everybody knew some side of him that other people didn't know, and I wanted that composite figure. Anyway, that's what I intended to do.
Unfortunately, we have time for only one more question, and it will be from our virtual audience.
Okay.
In terms of what Edward Said represents, what enemies would you wish Edward Said took during the Thatcher-Reagan Renaissance, and he didn't? Did he take them later on in his career?
Well, there's more than one, I would say. Okay, I have to say, and this sounds convenient of me to say this now, but I never trusted Christopher Hitchens. I never trusted his politics. I saw a seamy side of him in other kinds of venues, and although they were thick as thieves and they were tight as friends, I felt that Edward, who is this great man, but also had his flaws, like we all do, and is somebody who loved to be praised and loved to be around people who were influential and in power. And this made him susceptible to flattery. And I think that I even talked to him about Hitchens at one point, and he shut me down, as he often would in situations like that. He was very loyal and didn't want people talking out of school to him about other people, like creating enmity, right? So you can't really say it. He has to draw his own conclusions. So I wish he had taken Hitchens on without, of course, not collaborating with Hitchens on the things that they very successfully did. That wonderful sort of primer-like book, Blaming the Victims, that they put together. It was mostly Edward, but at least Hitchens signed his name to it, you know, where kind of like the question of Palestine, that earlier book, it supplies the facts on the ground and educates the uneducated on the issue. And Hitchens, for all of his bad sides, was a brave and outspoken on the Palestine issue. But I wish he had taken him on. I think that there's people within, this probably won't matter as much to people, but within the field of post-colonial studies, there are people that I think it would have been better for him to openly oppose. I know that he didn't think very highly of the work of Homi Bhabha. I just happen to know that, but he never would go after him, at least while naming him, because he does actually go after him in one sense. That Homi Bhabha at one point wrote this essay on Frantz Fanon that tried to make Fanon a kind of Lacanian theorist and sort of somebody not interested in the Algerian struggle, something that would require gymnastics to perform. And Edward, without naming Bhabha, says that this was a trashing of the legacy of Fanon, and quite opposite of the philological principles which he wanted to endorse when it came as a critic to reading texts, right? Because as a philologist, he's trying to say that it is possible to recover the truth about the past by the careful and responsible reading of texts. That's what he was trying to get across. So those would be two figures, I would say. But there's plenty of others. I was at lots of events with him, and at one point, I don't know, Colin McCabe went after the publication by Sean McBride on the New World Information Order, and I thought that Edward, who loves Sean McBride and who endorsed this book, just sat there and never fought Colin McCabe for saying these things. And I thought, I wish he had gone after him. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you very much. It was very fascinating, the wide net you've casted and the interesting ideas you've weaved throughout. And thank you everyone for joining us online and in person. You're welcome to join us in the courtyard where there's light refreshments, and the book is also for sale, Places of Mind. Thank you.
Thank you.